ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another episode of ISO FileMaker Magazine. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video tutorial, we're taking a look at the topic of user feedback using button bars. This is a creative use of a new FileMaker layout object. So what's really cool about the button bars is people are using them in all kinds of different ways. I've seen them being used as what they're intended, button bars, but also as hidden menus, hidden tree menus where they can expand out and they're using multiple button bar objects. In this video, I'm going to show you using button bars for a feedback mechanism. Let's take a look at the file. Alright, so I've jumped into the file and here we go. This is a really straightforward file. In fact, a lot of you can probably figure this one out on your own. You can see right here that I have some buttons. I have show info, show warn, shown error. The cool thing about this particular technique, it is not limited in terms of the number of different message types that you have. I only have 3 of them here, which represent some of our standards. You can also see that I have this persist button right here, as we're going to see that we can either show this on screen for a period of time, or we can make it persist and have the user take action. So if I wanted to show info, this obviously would come up and I have, hey, this is a message. If I want to show a warn, I've got, hey, this is a warning message, and I've got this one. Notice the icon is different on each one, and I can control the message and whatever it says. If I want it to persist, you can see that I can click this and I can have it be on screen, and because it's a button bar, the user has to actually tap it to dismiss it. So we get all of the advantages that you get with a button. In fact, even if I wanted to, this could be a popover, which is a really cool thing that could allow me to show extended information and then provide a dismiss or a done button or whatever you want to do. But you can see that I have to tap that in order to make it go away. Same with the warn. I now have to click or tap in order to dismiss. So let's take a look at the insides of how this is actually working. Having switched into layout mode on our example file here, which you can get over on FileMakerMagazine.com. If you're a subscriber, you can see how simple this actually is. Right here, I clearly have a button bar object. In fact, as I zoom in on this, you can see that I have this little hidden, and it happens to be, as I zoom back out and zoom in over here, I have it here. I have it on pretty much every one of the individual segments of the button bar object. Now, if you haven't worked with FileMaker 14 yet, they created a new object as I show my toolbar, and that is up here in the top. It is this one right here. It is our button bar tool. Now, a button bar tool is basically just like the button that we have right next to it, except that it sticks individual buttons into a singular object, which is the button bar. So within that, you have the ability to obviously have a standard button or a popover button as well. In fact, as I zoom out here, we can see that when I select the segment, which it shows it selected right now, I can double click and I'll get my HUD, my heads up display here, and you can see that I can choose to make this either a button or a popover button. So that's where I was mentioning you can do that. But for this purpose, I'm using it simply to show a message. Now the cool thing is, since I've already got the HUD up here, I can choose or add any of my own SVG icons. And again, I can have as many of these as I want. I happen to have 3 segments right now. I'm showing one of 3, but adding on one of these would simply be a matter of adding that right there and then changing to whatever I want it to display and then changing the text. And the cool thing about button bars is the text does actually access the calculation engine. Unlike the standard button, which does not access the calculation engine, it simply has just the ability to input text, although you can input a merge variable. So a merge variable would be something that looks like this. Variable, that's if you were use a locally scoped variable. Otherwise, you could put in just a $sign, which would be a global variable. I think you already know about that. But otherwise, this is the text. So the text that is in that button right now is currently fixed. So what we are actually looking for is we are looking for a situation where we can put in something dynamic that we can pass into a script that is used for the purpose of the display of the button. So if I'm going to do that, and let's go ahead and get rid of this particular segment. When I select on this, you can see that what I have clearly here is disp.message.text. Now, if you're not familiar with FileMaker, I am simply using a global variable that contains the text that I want to be rendered. So I am using my script in order to set this global variable of disp.message.text, just happens to be how I actually named it, a value of what I want to display. Now, controlling whether or not the actual message displays and whether or not it shows using the visibility setting, which is this little icon right here, which you're going to find under the Data tab of the inspector right over here. So there's our item right there. This is where you have the ability to do this in multiple different ways. And I want to explain this because this is a very cool thing to know about programming. One of the things that you can have is you can have a completely separate variable, which I'm doing right now, display.message.type. And that's because I'm handling 3 different types, an info, a warn, and an error. And all I've done is I've assigned an enumeration to those. I've said, okay, info is going to be 0, warn is going to be 1, and error is going to be 2. So it's just a 0-based incrementing of the numbers. I could use 1, 2, and 3 if I wanted to, and that makes sense. Most things in programming starts with 0. Now, what I was explaining is the difference between how you approach this. A super simple approach would be whether or not, if you were using a button bar just for 1, you would say whether or not the display.message.text, the text is what's the actual value that's being used on the actual button segment within the button bar, you can say, okay, if it's empty, go ahead and hide this particular object. Otherwise, if it's not empty, go ahead and show this object. But in this particular case, I'm using a separate variable. So there are 2 distinct variables. One is disp.message.text, which is what's shown on the button. That's where we're passing the message, and that's what's going to display, whatever's in that global variable. The next is, how are we going to control which segment of the button bar is actually shown? Well, I'm doing that with the additional global variable of disp.message.type. And then, of course, I said, as I stated before, I'm using an enumeration in order to identify which one is which. So clearly, if I have this one selected right here, this is if display does not equal 0, then I want you to hide, meaning when it is 0, he's going to show. This one, you can see right there, clearly, you're going to display if your message type does not equal 1. And then this one is display.messageType if it does not equal 2. So hopefully that makes sense. All of these guys are simply going to hide unless this global variable of display.message.type is equal to the value that they correspond to, 0, 1, and 2. Now, the cool thing is about these button bars is if I have a button bar with 3 segments and all of them are hidden except for one of them, all I have to do is simply select the button bar as a whole, go to the Position tab, and then I have full access to my anchoring capabilities right here. If I anchor both on the right and on the left, then what I get is whichever segment does show, it will simply expand to the full width, giving me my nice message up at the top of my UI. This is where, even if I added on another item, I would simply have to make sure that that item itself hides unless I want it to show, and this can be as small or as wide as I want, as long as it's the width of what I want to expand to. Simply a button bar, anything that is hidden, those segments will simply just sort of knock out, and any remaining segments will completely fill the area that you've specified. Also, abiding by your auto sizing settings right here. So, what are some of the other things you need to know? Well, take a look at this right up here where we've got the whole of the object itself. Now, clearly, you want to be able to control, if there's an accident, whether or not this whole object shows. And you need to be able to refresh this object, particularly with FileMaker Go, when messages change, because you may have a system where you show one message and then maybe they tap on the actual alert or user feedback and then it adds yet another message, maybe switching icons or giving them other information. Well, you're going to name the whole object itself, which I've done right here, button or bar.message. I tend to name all of my objects, whatever their object type is, portal.invoices, field dot whatever. Here we've got bar, short for button bar, dot message. If it's a button, it would be button dot whatever. Just a nomenclature I follow according to FileMakerStandards.org. So with this button bar also named, and then looking at the data, we can see that it also has a calculation that says, just like I was stating, if the display message.text is empty. In fact, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing both of the two variables that I am using. In other words, this whole button bar will never show. It will always hide unless there are values found within the list of these two global variables. If they are empty, then of course we want to hide this whole button bar and not even have it potentially appear on the user interface. So everything boils down to those two variables. It boils down to display.message.text and display.message.type. The rest of what we're going to be walking through is the way that the script works, and the cool thing about this whole technique is that I have made this so that it is very easy to copy and paste. All you really have to do is simply copy the button bar object first, actually the script first, because the script does not reference anything. The button bar here does actually reference something, but what it's referencing, fortunately, are things that are not tied into our structure, such as global variables. So the button bar itself, both of them will copy independently, but typically you want to copy scripts first and then layout objects afterwards, because layout objects typically refer to scripts. So let's take a look at the script. All right, so here we go with the script. There's just one of them that you need. That's what makes this so portable. You simply copy the script, you paste it into your solution, you go over, you copy that bar, and you paste that into your solution. As long as you don't have any conflicting named objects like bar.message, you're going to be good to go. So let's walk through the script and why it's structured the way that it is, because I'm always wanting you to learn more about FileMaker if you're not at a level where this immediately makes sense. If you're a developer and you've used FileMaker, you already get the value of the technique and you're ready to go. So the first thing that we're going to do in this particular item is we are going to allow user abort off. The reason that we're going to do that is because we are using the pause and resume. So we want to make sure that if the user clicks on anything else in the user interface, FileMaker will run that script, but when it comes here, we want to make sure that we finish out with this script and that the user can't actually cancel this process with Command or Control period, or Escape, I believe, on Windows. So the first thing that we do is by naming the actual script itself in the format of a function, we can tell ourselves what this script actually expects. It expects, number one, a type. Then it expects a message, the type being the enumerated value of 0 for info, 1 for warn, and 3 for error, and you can extend that as far as you want. We're also using following FileMaker. We've got the message next. Then we're following FileMaker's patterns of saying we've got an optional seconds because we are setting a default within this script if we don't supply seconds. Now what we've done is we've made this script sort of standalone, meaning it does not reference any fields. It uses all variables, local variables and global variables. So once we capture all of our individual parameters for this particular script, where it's saying get the script parameter 1, get the script parameter 2, and 3, we're going to be able to run the rest of the script. Now on script parameter 3, notice that I have right here the get as number. Any of the coercion functions, which that's what coercion is the process of converting one thing into another. If you're going to be doing any type of comparison, which we are going to do, in fact, you can see that right down here where we say if seconds is greater than 0. In this case, seconds is being compared with the greater than based on it being a number. But yet, when things are passed into scripts, one of the snafus that some newer users hit is they pass in the getScriptParameter, but what getScriptParameter typically comes in as is text. And so you don't get a direct comparison. So you need to coerce your data into the expected type. So in this case, when we're getting the third value of our getScriptParameter, or using the get value to get the third value, we are coercing that into the number so that we actually do a proper evaluation in the rest of our script. Now, the next thing that I do is I set up a default for this. If the developer does not supply the number of seconds, which I've indicated is optional, then of course I want to have some type of default. In fact, most of the time when you're scripting, you typically want to initialize or set defaults on objects and then simply override those defaults with whatever is being passed in. Here you can see that I'm now setting the actual seconds value. This is the setting of the default. So this is the default value that I want to use that's referenced in the rest of my script. This is setting the actual seconds default. And we're basically saying we've set a catch here as well for ourselves. If you haven't been working with FileMaker for any length of time, we can see how this actually reads. We can say if the seconds is greater than 10. In other words, from a programming standpoint, we've said, you know what, 10 seconds is a lot of time on screen. We don't want anybody else who might be also programming in our own FileMaker database. This would be in a shared environment. We don't want anybody else to actually make this go longer than 10 seconds. So we're saying if it's greater than 10 seconds, we are going to default to a maximum of 10 seconds. Otherwise, if the developer has not passed in the number of seconds, in other words, it's empty, then we're going to use the default of 3 seconds. Otherwise, we're going to use the value that was supplied, seconds. Now, the reason that I spent a little bit of time explaining this to you, if you haven't done a whole lot of programming, especially in FileMaker, what this can be sort of considered is defensive programming. You were saying, I'm the developer, I'm creating this implementation of this user feedback system. I don't ever want it to show up in my solution for longer than 10 seconds. If you do want to allow it, obviously it's going to be a little bit different here. Also, if nothing is supplied, I want it to by default be a minimum of at least 3 seconds. Otherwise, I want it to be what the user has been specified. So you can sort of think of this in terms of this is the ultimate control. I'm defining the minimum and the maximum, but I'm allowing the user, another developer or myself, to have any range in between. This whole statement is a very defensively coded statement, and that's why I wanted to actually explain that to you in terms of how it actually works. Now, the rest of what's going on is very simple. We're simply taking our inbound parameters. Here we set the message, here we set the type, and I'm simply setting the corresponding global variables which the button bar actually uses to those values. Could I have captured them directly into the global variables up here at top, straight from the get script parameter? Sure, I could have done that, but it reduces your flexibility in terms of how your script is actually, how it can be manipulated in the future. By predefining or declaring your input variables or your input parameters at the top of your script, you can then, within the rest of your script, determine what you want to do, especially your external variables, such as our display variables here. Finally, all we do is we refresh the object. Now, obviously, if the seconds is greater than 0, now what does that mean in terms of our script? Well, remember we have that persist option. So we want to give the flexibility of being able to bring something on screen and forcing the user to take an action. So instead of creating a completely separate script, we're going to program logic into our script that says we can have the best of both worlds. We can either have this show for a certain period of time on screen, or we can have it show for to persist on screen. This is what I love about programming, that when you get to a level, you realize that whatever the inbound data is, if you're looking for a range or within a range, which in this case it would be anywhere from 1 up to 10 seconds, or in this case I've got a minimum of 3, you can use other numbers or other values outside of your range in order to do other things. So in this case, I can say if seconds is greater than 0, then I'm obviously going to be pausing. You can also remember that I've specified up here that if nothing is supplied, we have this if is empty, it's going to use a default. But if I, as the developer, explicitly within the seconds put a 0 value, then that means that I want this message to persist and stay on screen, which is exactly what it will do. Essentially, the script would halt right here at a refresh object. And because this is a button bar, you can click this to dismiss it. So in fact, when we take a look at what actually is happening, go into layout mode, double click here and look at our button, we can see what we're doing right here. So looking at this object, you can see that each of the individual segments within the button bar are specified to be single-step scripts. So zoom back out and zoom back in. That single step helps me to avoid having to create one additional script. Now here's something that I really like about FileMaker. If as much as possible, anytime that you are working with a script that is using either local or global variables and not necessarily fields, remember that if you have access to FileMaker's calculation engine, you do not necessarily need an extra script. You want to avoid adding a lot of extra stuff if you can get away with it to your FileMaker database because it makes the overall management easier. So in this case, what I've done is I've taken the opportunity to use a single step of refresh object. Now, what does refresh object do? Well, look at that. Right there, it clears out the two variables that determine whether or not the whole button bar shows as a whole. But I'm using it within a let function, which does allow me to manipulate local or global variables, and I'm simply passing the result of the object name that I want to refresh. So this is just a tricky little use of using access to FileMaker's calculation engine via the refresh object. So when I click on this object to dismiss, if I had used a 0 value, which meant it would never go into my little script that would pause and then dismiss it for me, in this case it stays on screen and the simple click just gets rid of it with the single refresh object. Back over in the script, we can see that obviously if seconds were supplied, we just do what we would expect. We pause it for whatever duration of seconds it is. We then display, set our variables to be empty. Notice that here, you can actually, in FileMaker 14, it may be in 13 as well, you don't actually have to supply those double quotes. If you actually supply nothing and simply declare your global variable, it will clear that global variable. It may have been an addition either in FileMaker 13, maybe in FileMaker 14, but a nice thing where I don't have to add those double quotes. And finally, we refresh. And that is how we can get away with using button bars for the purpose of user feedback. It's a very cool way to interact with the user. And the great thing is, because the button bar object can overlay on all of your other layout objects, all you have to do is simply have it just drag it in and out of the screen. So typically what I'm doing is I'll have this right here, and if I have some layout objects underneath this, maybe some text, even a button, so forth, all I have to do is make sure that this is my frontmost object, and I just drag it right back in. And then I just drag it right back out. In fact, most of the time what I'm doing is I'm simply aligning it with some other object in my user interface. I'm going over to my position tab. I modify my user interface here, do whatever I'm going to do, give the button a name, and then I just say, okay, select these two objects and then align them. Done deal. It's overlaid, browse mode, and I'm ready to go. I can dismiss, and all of my layout objects are underneath. So that is a very creative use of button bars for the purpose of user feedback. I hope throughout the course of this video you've been able to learn more about coding and programming in FileMaker Pro. That's always my objective over at FileMakerMagazine.com. My name is Matt Petrowski, and I'm wishing you best of luck with your own FileMaker database, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.FileMakerMagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.